The sun was setting over the quiet town of Oakwood, casting a warm golden glow over the streets. James Walker, a 68-year-old Black War veteran, sat on a bench in the park, enjoying the calm evening. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his old uniform, though worn, was a symbol of the pride he felt from his time serving his country. James had lived in Oakwood for many years, and while life had not always been easy, he had found a sense of peace in his retirement. As he sat quietly, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a police officer walking toward him. The officer's uniform was crisp and clean, and he had a stern expression on his face. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said as he stopped in front of James. "What are you doing here?" James stood up slowly, surprised by the question. "I'm just sitting here, enjoying the evening." "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer looked James up and down, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like the way you're looking at me. What's your name?" the officer demanded, his tone harsh. James, taken aback by the officer's aggression, stood his ground. "My name is James Walker. I'm just a man sitting in a park. Is that a crime now?" The officer's face twisted into a scowl. "I don't trust people like you," he said, his voice rising. "You should be more careful about where you are and who you talk to." James felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He had never experienced such hostility in Oakwood before, especially not from a police officer. He had always tried to live his life with dignity, but now it seemed like his presence alone was enough to cause trouble. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just sitting here, trying to relax." But the officer wasn't listening. He took a step closer to James, his face red with anger. "I don't like your attitude," the officer growled. Without warning, he shoved James, knocking him off balance. James stumbled backward, but before he could regain his footing, the officer swung his fist and landed a punch squarely on James's face. The force of the punch sent James crashing to the ground. He tried to get up, but his head spun and his vision blurred. Blood dripped from his nose as he struggled to stay conscious. The officer stood over him, breathing heavily, and muttered under his breath, "You shouldn't have challenged me." As James lay on the ground, unable to move, the officer turned and walked away, leaving the elderly man in a heap. The park was now eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of birds chirping and a few footsteps on the sidewalk. James's world felt like it was spinning, and he could feel himself slipping in and out of consciousness. In the distance, a car pulled up. A figure stepped out and rushed toward James. It was his son, Elijah Walker, who had been working nearby when he received a call about the incident. Elijah, a 32-year-old man who had spent his life looking up to his father, ran to his side with panic in his eyes. "Dad!" Elijah cried, kneeling beside him. He could see the blood on his father's face and the bruises starting to form. "What happened? Are you okay?" James struggled to open his eyes, his words barely a whisper. "I'm fine, son. Just help me up." But Elijah could see that his father was far from fine. He quickly called for an ambulance, his heart racing as he tried to help James sit up. "Stay with me, Dad. The ambulance is on the way. Don't close your eyes." But the damage had already been done. James's head throbbed with pain, and his body was weak from the blow. He fought to stay awake, but the darkness began to take over. As Elijah held his father's hand, a deep sense of anger and disbelief grew inside him. He couldn't understand how someone, especially a police officer, could do this to his father. What had happened to the man who had served his country with pride, only to be treated like this in his own neighborhood? As the ambulance arrived, Elijah couldn't help but wonder how this incident would change their lives forever. He would soon find out that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would bring more questions and revelations than he could have ever imagined. Elijah sat beside his father in the back of the ambulance, holding his hand tightly. The paramedics worked quickly, checking James's vital signs and trying to stop the bleeding from his nose. Elijah could feel his heart racing, and his mind kept replaying the scene in the park. How could a police officer do this to his father? What had happened? Elijah didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This was not over. Is he going to be okay? Elijah asked the paramedic, his voice trembling. The paramedic, a calm woman in her 30s, looked at him reassuringly. We're doing everything we can. We'll take him to the hospital to run more tests, but we need to make sure he's stable first. Elijah nodded, though he couldn't shake the anger and confusion swirling inside him. His father, a proud war veteran who had sacrificed so much for this country, had never deserved this. All James wanted was to enjoy a peaceful day in the park, but now he was being rushed to the hospital, all because of an act of violence from someone who was supposed to protect the community. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, Elijah followed the paramedics as they rushed his father into the emergency room. He sat in the waiting area, his mind racing with questions. What had caused the officer to act like that? Was it just because of his father's age, his race, or was there something more to the story? Elijah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, and he knew he needed answers. Hours passed, and Elijah grew more anxious. His father was still in the ER, and there had been no updates. He tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty was overwhelming. As he sat in the waiting room, he began to make calls. First, he called his mother to let her know what had happened. Then he called his uncle, hoping he could provide some advice or support. But still, no one had the answers. Eventually, a doctor came out of the ER. He looked tired, but there was a small sense of relief in his eyes. Elijah? The doctor asked. Yes, Elijah replied, standing up quickly. How's my father? He's stable now, the doctor said. We've run some tests, and we'll need to keep him under observation for a while. The punch caused some head trauma, but thankfully, it wasn't as severe as we initially feared. He's still unconscious, but he should wake up soon. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Thank you, doctor, he said, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. But even with this good news, his mind was still on the officer. Why had this happened? The doctor gave him a comforting smile. Your father's a strong man. He'll be okay. As the doctor left, Elijah took a seat in the waiting room, his thoughts still swirling. He couldn't understand why someone would hurt an elderly man, especially a veteran. His father had served this country, fought in wars, and had lived a life of dignity. Yet, in a moment of peace, he was attacked by someone who was supposed to protect him. Elijah clenched his fists, a deep sense of anger rising within him. He knew this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that had failed his father and so many others. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was a news station. They had heard about the incident and wanted to do an interview. Elijah wasn't sure if he was ready to talk to anyone yet, but he knew this story needed to be told. His father's bravery deserved to be recognized, and the truth about what had happened needed to be shared. He took a deep breath and answered the phone, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Yes, I'll talk. As the conversation continued, Elijah realized that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to uncover, and he wasn't going to stop until he got the answers his father deserved. The journey to justice for his father had just begun, and Elijah was ready to fight for him, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur for Elijah. His father, James, remained in the hospital under close observation, his condition improving but still fragile. Elijah visited him every day, sitting by his side, speaking to him softly, and hoping for signs that his father would wake up soon. But no matter how many times he spoke, James remained unconscious, and Elijah's heart grew heavier with each passing hour. Meanwhile, news of the incident spread quickly. The local news stations reported on the attack, and people around town began to talk. Elijah knew this was his chance to make sure the truth was heard. The situation had to be addressed, not just for his father, but for the sake of everyone who had experienced injustice at the hands of people meant to protect them. On the third day after the attack, Elijah decided to take action. He contacted a local lawyer, hoping they could provide some guidance on how to move forward. The lawyer, a woman named Rachel, was quick to respond. "I understand how difficult this situation must be for you and your father," Rachel said over the phone. "But we need to make sure we have all the facts before we approach the police department. We can't rush into anything without the full picture." Elijah agreed. "I just want to know why this happened. Why did the officer attack my dad? He didn't do anything wrong." "I understand your anger," Rachel said, her voice calm and steady, "and we'll get to the bottom of it. But for now, I recommend you focus on making sure your father is okay and that the medical team is taking good care of him. The rest can wait." Elijah hung up the phone with a deep sense of relief. At least he had someone on his side who knew how to handle this kind of situation. But even as Rachel assured him that things would get better, Elijah couldn't help but feel frustrated. The incident had shaken him to his core, and he couldn't understand how anyone, especially a police officer, could have treated his father like that. He spent the rest of the afternoon reflecting on what had happened. His father had dedicated his life to serving his country and had earned respect through years of hard work and sacrifice. Yet here he was, recovering from an injury caused by someone who was supposed to protect him. The injustice was overwhelming. The next morning, Elijah received a call from the hospital. It was a nurse telling him that his father was waking up. Elijah rushed to the hospital, eager to see James and talk to him. He couldn't wait to finally hear his father's voice again. When Elijah arrived at the hospital, he walked into James's room and saw his father lying in the bed, his eyes slowly opening. "Dad," Elijah whispered, walking up to him. James blinked a few times, his vision blurry, but then he focused on Elijah's face. "Elijah, what happened?" he asked weakly, his voice hoarse. Elijah smiled, holding his father's hand. "You're going to be okay, Dad. You're safe now." James looked confused for a moment. Then his face darkened. "The officer, he hit me, didn't he?" Elijah nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yes, Dad. But we're going to get through this. We're going to make sure this never happens again." James's eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "I don't understand, Elijah. I've fought for this country, and I never thought I'd be treated like this. How could someone who swore to protect people do that to me?" Elijah squeezed his father's hand. "I don't know, Dad, but I promise you, we'll find out. You didn't deserve any of this, and we're going to make sure it gets fixed." James nodded slowly, still weak but relieved to hear Elijah's determination. "I trust you, son. I've always trusted you." Elijah's heart swelled with pride. His father had always been his hero, and now it was his turn to be strong for him. He promised himself that he wouldn't rest until justice was served. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Elijah was prepared to fight for his father, no matter what it took. As Elijah sat with his father, talking and comforting him, he knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. But with his father's strength and his own determination, he was ready to take on whatever came next. Elijah spent the next few days by his father's side, making sure he was comfortable and keeping him updated on everything that was happening. His father's condition improved steadily, but the emotional toll on both of them was undeniable. As much as Elijah wanted to focus on his father's recovery, he couldn't shake the anger and confusion over the officer's actions. James, still weak but alert, kept asking Elijah about the situation. Every time they talked about it, the pain and disbelief in his father's voice were impossible to ignore. "How could someone do this to me, Elijah? I've always been respectful. I've served this country, and now this," James would say, his voice tinged with frustration. Elijah did his best to calm his father, but his own frustration grew each day. He felt helpless, and he knew that things couldn't just go on without some kind of action. "Dad," Elijah said one morning as he sat beside his father, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. We need to take this to the right people. Make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." James nodded slowly, though his tired eyes reflected his skepticism. I know you want to fix it, Elijah, but I'm not sure it's that simple. The system, son, it's not easy to fight against. I understand, but we can't just let this slide, Elijah said, determination in his voice. We'll talk to a lawyer. We'll go public if we have to. People need to know what happened to you. James looked at his son, a mixture of pride and concern on his face. You're strong, Elijah. I've always known that. But I don't want you to get hurt in this fight. Elijah squeezed his father's hand, his voice soft but firm. Don't worry, Dad. I'll fight this, and I'll make sure the truth is heard. You didn't deserve this, and no one else should either. The next day, Elijah met with a lawyer, a woman named Sarah who had experience with civil rights cases. She was kind but straight to the point. This is a serious situation, Elijah. The fact that your father is a veteran gives us some leverage, but we need to gather all the facts first. It's going to take time, but we can definitely take action. Sarah asked Elijah for all the details he could provide about the incident. He recounted the events at the park, the officer's aggression, and the punch that had sent his father to the ground. He also mentioned the confusion and the way people in the neighborhood had been talking about the incident. We need to find witnesses, Sarah said, writing down notes. We also need to get the officer's record. If this is a pattern, it could help us in court, but we have to be careful. Police departments have a lot of power, and they'll try to protect one of their own. Elijah nodded. He knew the stakes were high. He had heard about the struggles that many people faced when trying to hold the police accountable, but he was willing to take on the challenge for his father. He couldn't let this be brushed aside. Over the next few weeks, Elijah worked tirelessly with Sarah to gather evidence and information. They found a few witnesses who had seen the incident in the park, though some were hesitant to get involved. The fear of retaliation was real. Elijah also learned that the officer who had attacked his father had been involved in other incidents of misconduct, but nothing had ever been done about it. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the lawyer's office, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of determination. The fight was far from over, but every step they took brought them closer to justice. He knew that he was not just fighting for his father. He was fighting for everyone who had been wronged and ignored by a system that should protect them. As Elijah walked out of the office that day, his heart was heavy, but there was a spark of hope inside him. He was ready to stand up for what was right, no matter what it took. His father had given everything for this country, and now Elijah was going to do everything he could to make sure his father's fight wasn't in vain. Elijah woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose. The days had been long, and the road ahead still felt uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. His father, James, had always been there for him, showing him the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult. Now, it was Elijah's turn to do the same. He had spent the last few days working closely with Sarah, the lawyer, gathering more evidence, and reaching out to potential witnesses. The process had been slow, but things were starting to take shape. Sarah had sent a formal request to the police department for the officer's record, and Elijah had received a few calls from neighbors who had witnessed the incident in the park. Some were willing to speak out, while others remained hesitant, afraid of the possible consequences. Elijah spent the morning making more phone calls, trying to track down anyone who could help them. He was determined not to let fear stop him. He knew that if they wanted justice for his father, they had to keep pushing forward, no matter how uncomfortable it got. That afternoon, Elijah received a call from Sarah. "Elijah, we've got some news," she said, her voice steady but serious. "We've reviewed the officer's record, and it's not good. There have been complaints about him in the past, but nothing ever came of them." Elijah felt a mix of anger and disbelief. "So he's gotten away with it before, just like he did with my dad." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "But this time, we're not going to let it slide. We have the evidence we need to take this to court." Elijah felt his heart race as he processed her words. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. They had the information, they had the witnesses, and now it was time to take action. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't back down now. "I'm ready," Elijah said, his voice firm. "Let's do this." Over the next few weeks, Sarah filed the necessary paperwork and began preparing for the court case. Elijah continued to speak with witnesses, some of whom had been too afraid to come forward initially. With each conversation, he could sense that people were starting to understand the seriousness of the situation. The truth needed to come out, and they were all part of making sure it did. Elijah also made sure to stay by his father's side. James's health continued to improve, but the emotional scars from the incident ran deep. James had always been a strong man, but the brutal assault by the police officer had shaken his confidence. Elijah tried to reassure him every day, telling him that things would get better and that justice would be served. One evening, as Elijah and his father sat together in the living room, James spoke up. "You know, son, I never thought something like this would happen to me. I served my country, did what was asked of me, and this is how I'm treated." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on his father's. "I know, Dad. It's not fair, but we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We're going to make sure that officer is held accountable for what he did." James gave a weak smile. "I know you will. You've always had a way of making things right." Elijah nodded, a sense of pride filling him. He knew his father was proud of him, and he couldn't let him down. This fight was bigger than just their family. It was about standing up for what was right, for everyone who had been mistreated, ignored, or hurt by those who were supposed to protect them. As the days went by, the case against the officer gained more attention. The local news stations began reporting on the story, and more people came forward with their support. The community was beginning to rally behind Elijah and his father. The more people who spoke out, the more momentum their case gained. It became clear that this wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a larger issue that needed to be addressed. Elijah knew they still had a long road ahead, but he also knew that they were on the right path. He was ready to keep fighting, to make sure his father's story was heard, and that justice would be served. The day of the court hearing had arrived. Elijah woke up early, his mind full of thoughts and worries. He couldn't help but think about his father, who had fought so hard for the country, only to be treated in such a cruel way. Now, Elijah was ready to fight for him. He was determined to get justice, not only for his father, but for everyone who had suffered because of the abuse of power. As he arrived at the courthouse, the weight of the situation hit him. He had spent weeks preparing, speaking to witnesses, working with Sarah, and gathering all the evidence they could find. The courtroom was filled with people: the judge, the lawyers, the officer's colleagues, and even members of the community who had come to show their support. Elijah's hands trembled as he entered the courtroom, his heart beating faster with every step. He looked over at his father, who was sitting in the front row, his face calm but his eyes tired. James had insisted on being there, wanting to show his support for Elijah and the case they were fighting. Elijah knew his father was still hurt, both physically and emotionally, but having him there gave him strength. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the case began. The prosecutor stood up, ready to make the opening statements. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because a man who has served this country with honor was attacked for no reason. James Walker, a veteran, was violently assaulted by Officer Davis. This was not an isolated incident. Officer Davis has a history of violent behavior, and today we will prove that this attack was not only unjust, but a violation of the law." Elijah felt a surge of emotion hearing those words. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The prosecutor's words were powerful, and he could see that the jury was paying attention. The evidence they had gathered was solid, and it was clear that Officer Davis had a lot to answer for. After the opening statements, it was time for the defense. The officer's lawyer stood up, confident and poised. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Officer Davis, acted in self-defense. He felt threatened by Mr. Walker and was simply trying to protect himself. We will show that this was a misunderstanding, and the actions taken were necessary to ensure Officer Davis's safety. Elijah clenched his fists as he listened. How could they say it was self-defense? His father had been sitting peacefully, minding his own business. The anger inside him grew, but he kept his composure, knowing that this was just the beginning. The truth would come out. The trial continued for several more hours, with both sides presenting their evidence and arguments. Elijah listened carefully, taking notes on everything that was said. Sarah, the lawyer, stood firm in her arguments, pointing out the inconsistencies in the defense's case and highlighting the police officer's past actions. She also made it clear that there was no reason for the officer to resort to violence when James had been calm and cooperative. When it was their turn to present the witnesses, Elijah felt a mix of hope and fear. These people were the key to the case. They had seen what happened in the park, and their testimony could make all the difference. One by one, the witnesses took the stand, recounting what they had seen. Some had been hesitant at first to get involved, but now they were speaking out for justice. Their words were powerful, and Elijah could feel the weight of the truth growing stronger with each person who testified. As the day came to a close, Elijah sat next to his father, feeling exhausted but hopeful. The fight wasn't over, but they were one step closer to the justice they deserved. Elijah knew that it was not just about winning this case. It was about making sure that others would never have to face what his father had endured. "I'm proud of you, son," James whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You've done everything you can. You've stood up for what's right." Elijah looked at his father, his heart swelling with love. "We're in this together, Dad. I won't stop until we get the justice you deserve." And with that, Elijah knew that whatever came next, he would keep fighting. For his father, for the truth, and for the many others who had been hurt by those meant to protect them. As the final day of the trial approached, Elijah could feel the weight of everything he had been fighting for. The courtroom had been full of emotions, from the painful testimony of witnesses to the deep sense of justice everyone hoped would prevail. Elijah had done everything he could to help his father, but now the decision was in the hands of the jury. They were the ones who could change everything. The morning of the closing arguments, Elijah sat with his father in the courtroom. James had been recovering well, his health improving each day, but the emotional scars from the attack would take much longer to heal. He had always been a proud man, someone who had given so much for his country, and the treatment he had received from Officer Davis had shaken him deeply. As the court session began, the prosecutor stood up, ready to give the closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've presented the evidence. We've heard the witnesses. We've seen the truth." James Walker was a man simply sitting in a park, minding his own business when he was attacked by Officer Davis without provocation. This is not about one officer's actions. This is about a system that needs to be held accountable. We ask you to deliver justice for Mr. Walker and for every citizen who deserves to feel safe in their community. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. This was it, the final moment. He looked at his father, who nodded slightly, as if telling him to stay strong. The prosecution's words had been powerful, but now it was time for the defense. The defense attorney, calm but with an air of arrogance, stood and addressed the jury. "The prosecution would have you believe that my client, Officer Davis, acted maliciously, but that's not the case. The officer feared for his safety, and his actions were made in response to a perceived threat. This is not a case of assault. This is a case of self-defense. We ask you to look at the facts, not the emotions surrounding this trial." Elijah's jaw clenched. He knew it wasn't self-defense. His father hadn't done anything to deserve this, but the defense was trying to twist the story. He had to remain calm. They had the truth on their side, and he believed in the system. The jury would see the truth. After the closing arguments, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. Elijah's nerves were on edge as he and his father waited for what felt like hours. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the foreman stood up to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Davis, guilty of excessive force." The words hit Elijah like a wave, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The justice they had been fighting for had finally arrived. His father's case had been heard, and the officer who had attacked him would be held accountable for his actions. Elijah felt a sense of relief and pride that he hadn't experienced in years. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as the judge called for order. Elijah turned to his father, who was still sitting beside him, his face stoic, but his eyes reflecting the weight of everything they had been through. James placed his hand on Elijah's. "You did it, son. You fought for what was right, and you won. I'm proud of you." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes as he smiled at his father. "We did it, Dad. We did this together." As they walked out of the courtroom, Elijah felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just about the victory in the court. It was about the journey they had been through, the pain they had overcome, and the hope they had found in each other. Elijah knew that this was just the beginning of healing, not only for his father, but for the community. The victory in court didn't erase all the pain, but it brought justice. It showed that the system could work, that even the most powerful could be held accountable. Elijah had fought for his father, and in doing so, he had fought for something bigger, a better future for everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. As they walked out into the sunlight, Elijah looked at his father and smiled. He had kept his promise to make sure his father's fight was not in vain. And for that, Elijah knew that he would always be proud.